Well, hey folks, welcome to the Jason Wright Show. I am so excited to have with me today Dr. Stephen Hussey, the author of his new book, Understanding the Heart, which is a magnificent read for especially somebody like me, the layperson who likes to figure out what's going on with my health and my body. And I'm so excited to have Dr. Hussey here today. Dr. Hussey, welcome back to the Jason Wright Show, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Well, this was something that we just were able to kind of talk about. And I think I pre-ordered your book right before you and I first met on the show. And now I've had the opportunity to read it. And man, well done. This is such a great book for anyone that just wants to better understand how the heart functions. And again, or like kind of you and I talked about offline, not to, take the place of physicians and legacy medical practitioners, but to just get a better understanding so you can ask better questions. And so I just want to say congratulations. It's a great book right off the start, man.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's great to hear that. I'm glad people are enjoying it.
Well, okay, so here's where I want to start with this. Let's just, for those who may not have heard our first episode, or even if you heard it, just to reinforce, kind of talk about your story and why you became so interested in the heart. What happened to you?
Yeah, well, as a child, I had a lot of ailments, I guess. I had a lot of inflammatory health issues, everything from irritable bowel syndrome to allergies to, I used to break out in hives all over my body and we didn't know why. And, I had all kinds of inflammatory things, asthma, but eventually ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes, where the inflammation got so bad that my body got confused and attacked part of my pancreas. And now I'm type 1 diabetic and my body doesn't make insulin anymore. And I'm happy to say that throughout my health journey, I've cured most of those ailments that I had, except for the type 1 diabetes, which is kind of collateral damage that resulted from that inflammation. And so being type 1 diabetic, it heavily predisposes me to heart disease and other diseases, but especially heart disease. And so, throughout my, as I grew up and throughout my education, I was just always interested in heart disease, how I can prevent this, because of this. And, in high school, I didn't have the foresight that I have today about trying to prevent things. So I didn't really take care of myself much in high school. But once I got to college, I started learning about health, and figured out that the way that I lived my life had a direct impact on how I could manage this condition. And it's ultimately when I got rid of all those other inflammatory conditions, was when I started doing that. And so it's just been this, this journey for me of gathering information, changing my lifestyle, getting feedback from that, and just trial and error type stuff. And, but yeah, I was especially interested in the heart, and how I could prevent heart disease. And so as I just soak up everything. I have this good baseline medical education that everybody gets when they go to any sort of medical professional school. So that helped me in learning about these other things. But I came across a lot of stuff that was very contrary to what I learned, or what I've been told about the heart. And, I started sharing that maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, and people seem to like it. And so I decided to put it all down in a book, and that's where we have today.
Do you think then, and I don't know if you remember or not, but I told you last time, my daughter, my youngest daughter, she shares your, both of you guys have type 1 diabetes. And I can tell you that Abby, one of the if there is a silver lining or benefit, it's kind of what you just touched on there. As someone who has type 1 diabetes, you're pretty much thrust into this world of having to understand your body in a way that most people don't. And so with that, what was it that when you started figuring out, because I learned something from your book that I should have known, but I did not, with regard to glucose causing scarring of the heart and the problems that can cause. So where was it that you started kind of just as a general interest, taking it to a different level? But and then what actually, I know that there was a pivotal moment with your heart that happens that I think is going to dispel a lot of the understanding that people have that listen to this. It's that, you did not fit, other than type 1 diabetes, you really don't fit the profile of someone that's going to have heart disease. So kind of take us to where you went from just you're diagnosed with type 1. So now you're looking at your blood. Obviously, you're looking at your glucose levels in a way that most people don't do. But then you take it a step further, and then kind of what's the real demarcation point of, okay, now it's not just kind of novelty. I want to dive into this at a much deeper level.
Yeah, well, like when I was diagnosed, I was 9 years old, and I really didn't understand anything the doctor was saying to me. I just knew my mom was like sitting next to me crying that I was been diagnosed with this, and so I was like, oh, it must be bad, I guess. But I think that even though like, because like when I was first diagnosed as a kid, I was pretty diligent about it, and the doctors were so surprised that as a type 1, my A1C was like 6.2 or something like that, which is high for the average person, but really good for a type 1. And but then like in high school, and I became this defiant teenager and didn't take care of myself and stuff. But what it taught me, though, like having to manage type 1 diabetes, just it just taught me, or it just exposed me to this idea of kind of almost like biohacking, because I'm tracking something, and I was doing it because I was told to. I told I needed to if I wanted to feel good and manage my blood sugars, and people were telling me that long term it could cause issues if I don't do it. So that's why I was doing it then. But then when I got into college, and I got interested, like I'd been inspired by my pediatric endocrinologist to become some sort of physician. And so I started taking these science classes that you need to get into some kind of medical professional school, and chemistries and biologies and things like that. And I didn't do well at first. I was like, I couldn't apply these things to anything. I couldn't apply what I was learning to anything. And so I was just kind of treading water. And then eventually, maybe like in my sophomore year, I took like, I chose my major as health and wellness, and started taking all these health and wellness classes. And then I started applying what I was learning in all those science classes to health. And I was like, oh, like now it makes sense. And it was way easier to learn when I had something to apply those sciences to as I was learning. And I also started experimenting, like, if I do this health behavior, how does that affect my ability to my blood sugars, or my ability to maintain blood sugars? And I'd already been exposed to that kind of biohacking feedback that you look for. And so it helped me get, do these little experiments and get direct feedback. And how does exercising this way versus that way affect blood sugar? And so then you're like, well, blood sugar is not the only marker I could look at. And you start looking at all kinds of different things. And so it was just kind of like this, step-by-step process that kept building on itself, and so I tried different diets. I tried different, lots of different routines, as far as health goes. And eventually is, people think that, like, lots of times I work with clients or patients or whatever. And I'll say, this is probably what you should do. I don't expect you to do it tomorrow, though, because I didn't wake up one day and just start doing the things I do today. It was a very gradual process. I had to work up to it and learn a lot of things. But I'm here to tell you that this is what I think you should do, but I don't expect you to be perfect tomorrow. Let's work on, let's do this one first, and then add this, and then add that, And so it's just this very gradual process. So yeah, and then, despite everything I know, and everything I do, I can't say that I was following my own advice to a T at some points in my life. But yeah, in January 2020, I had a heart attack, and it kind of blew me away. It scared the crap out of me.
Sure.
And I have my reasoning for why I think it happened. And so I was sitting there in the hospital recovering from the heart attack and just being frustrated with all the advice I was getting from the physicians on how I should recover from this, or why it happened in the first place. And just lots of shutdown of conversation. Like nobody wanted to talk about it. And I was just like, these people are here doing their job, and I'm sure that they care and they have their opinions. They have what they've been taught. But no one's going to care more about my health than me. And that's the way it's been for me since I became passionate about health. And so, based on all the information I knew about the heart, and based on what they were telling me, I knew that there was no way I was going to follow their advice. And yes, I understand that someone else in that situation wouldn't have the background knowledge that I have, and maybe wouldn't be able to make those same decisions, which is why, the doubts I had in the hospital about releasing this book, and about, people thinking that I'm a hypocrite and things like that, all went away when I experienced what I experienced in the hospital. And I was like, even if people decide not to do what I did, or they think that my advice is wrong because I had a heart attack, and how you can't even prevent your own heart attack, so it must be wrong. Like, if you think that way, that's fine. But the information needs to be out there. Like, if people are in my situation and they are trying to decide what to do going forward, or they're trying to prevent what happened to me or heart disease in general. Like, all the information has to be out there. And unfortunately, the information that I present in my book is not out there enough. And so people don't have the whole story. So how can you make the correct decision for you if all the information is not out there? And so that's why I decided to release the book. And honestly, nothing I wrote in the book changed after I had a heart attack. I mean, I still believe, and I mean, the research that I quote in the book doesn't change because I had a heart attack, you know? Right. It just, it means I need to work harder. It means I need to do better. And hopefully, that won't happen again. But yeah, so like, that's kind of my whole process, in a nutshell, like everything that's happened to me that's led me to where I am today. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I think that, what I loved what you wrote when you wrote that, I am not a cardiovascular surgeon or whatever, a cardiologist. I am a well-educated patient. I think that is so key, and that's what I want the takeaway to be. And so, just with that, I want to read literally from the book, so that anyone listening to this, and I am encouraging everyone that has any concern for managing their heart health, and again, just understanding it. And I'm kind of like you, Doc. I mean, I geek out on this stuff. I try to understand my body as best I can, but you taught me things because I'm just on my own. I don't go as deep into the weeds as you did. And then, you write here, and I think this is so well said. Many of the ideas presented in this book are very different from what you will find within the medical practice of cardiology, a field of medicine that has been proving unsuccessful at preventing heart disease and fostering good heart health. Instead, this book presents information about the heart, what it is, why it is there, the ways it can malfunction, and how we can keep it healthy. It is my hope that being under the care of the correct doctor and being armed with the information in this book will empower people to take back control of their health to prevent and even reverse heart disease. I love that, because here's the thing. I always tell people, you got to have a why. He who has a big enough why can overcome almost any how, as Nietzsche said, and then also Viktor Frankl said. And if we understand, and that's what I love about this, you give an idea of, okay, I'm not going to try to tell you, I'm not going to try to replace your doctor. Let me show you how the heart works, and then you conclude for yourself. And that's the cool thing about it. Like I told you before we got on, as I was reading the book, much better prepared than I was with our last conversation, because the book hadn't come out yet. I was like, oh, I'm able to finish this. I get where this is going as far as just how the heart operates, and knowing that makes me better prepared to go. Again, I'm not saying I'm going to take the place of my physician with my knowledge by any means, but also the legacy medical community, and I've said it a number of times on this show, they're kind of at a disadvantage, and they have to diagnose, prescribe. The opportunity costs that they face are so high they've got so many patients, so little time, and that's what they do. And there's no one to really walk alongside after that patient leaves to go, hey, the physician is just not in a position to walk along beside you day by day, week by week, planning your meals, planning your activities and your actions. And so I think that's what I like most about this, is that it's the why that you really nail on this. So well done on that. Okay, so now let's get into some of the nitty gritty of it. As it relates to understanding the heart, one of the biggest takeaways that you bring forward is this idea that most of us, we think the heart is just this big pump that just puts blood through from our heads to our toes, all through our body constantly. It's this big muscle. You'll hear people say, well, the heart is a muscle and it's pumping blood through our bodies at all times. Okay, so correct that theory.
Yeah, so there's actually quite a bit of evidence, that the heart is not the main mover of the blood in the body. That it's actually impossible for it to be, based on its size and its efficiency and the power that it can create. And so yeah, if the heart is definitely contracting, and so that's what I say. It's not pumping. I mean, it's doing a little bit of pumping, but no more than enough pumping to just move the blood through the chambers of the heart. That's all the force that it can create, and that's all it really needs to do, anyways. But it is contracting. And it is contracting a lot. So it's a very metabolically demanding issue. But the reason it's contracting is different than what we've been told. And so like the blood, it moves throughout the body largely on its own. because of this idea that water can hold energy. And this is research from the lab of Gerald Pollack. So water can hold energy, and when it holds energy, it actually can structure itself into a gel-like state. So it's called the fourth phase of water. It's not solid, not liquid, but it's more of a gel state. It can structure itself onto the lining of a hydrophilic surface, and the arteries are hydrophilic surfaces, water-loving surfaces. And so when it does that, the way that it does that, we don't have to get into the details, but the way that it structures itself actually creates an energy gradient that starts the flow of fluid, of water, or whatever's in that water. And this flow will go on indefinitely as long as sufficient energy is put into the system, so that the water can absorb the energy and continue to maintain that structure-water balance. And so the water, or the blood, is moving largely on its own. And there are things like I said, the heart does do a little bit of pumping, but it's more just contracting. And there's one-way valves in the veins that prevent backflow, and there's contraction of muscle that gets blood flowing a little bit too. But largely, it's due to this energy gradient created in the system that keeps blood moving. And so, if we think about it in that sense, we have to think about what is something that we know of, like within engineering or something, that water is flowing into, and then is moved through, and then moved out another way, and that's called a hydraulic ram, which I didn't know what that was when I first read it. So I don't worry, people. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. But there's lots of YouTube videos you can watch about what a hydraulic ram is. But there's no it all operates based on pressure changes and flow that's already happening. And so if that's what's happening in our arteries and veins, there's already flow happening. The heart acts more like a hydraulic ram. We're really two hydraulic rams put together, because there's a right and left atria and a right and left ventricle. And so a hydraulic ram is something that, it takes flowing water from somewhere and just kind of redirects it somewhere else. But in the process, like usually up a hill, like like if we're moving water from somewhere. In the heart, it's from, the right side of the heart to the lungs, and then back to the left side of the heart, and then out into the arteries. So if we think about it like a hydraulic ram, then we have to say, well, why is the heart there? If it's acting like this hydraulic ram and it's not pumping blood, the reason that it's there is that there are multiple ways that you can energize blood, or energize water, and the blood is about half water, and one of the ways is infrared light, or some sort of radiant energy to the system. Another way is like electromagnetic fields, the correct electromagnetic fields, not the wrong ones like Wi-Fi and things like that, but the right ones like that come from the earth and other living beings and things like that. But also vortexing, which are spiraling or swishing around the fluid in the presence of oxygen. And there's always oxygen in the blood, even in the venous blood. There's still oxygen in it. It's less oxygen than the arterial blood, but there's still oxygen there. And so the heart is more like this vortexing organ. As the blood flows through the heart, the contraction of different muscles and different chambers of the heart, and the flow through the valves creates this swishing, this vortexing, this spiraling, whatever you want to call it. And that energizes the water in the blood in the presence of oxygen, which then allows for, or allows it, the blood to, or the water in the blood to form the structured water in lining the arteries when it gets out into the peripheral arteries. So that's one reason that the heart is there. The other reason is that it helps maintain pressure in the system. There's a reason it's placed right in the middle of the arteries and the veins. It's because that if we have a stress response, or we exercise, like go for a run or something like that, that the tissues will demand blood, and that's what drives blood flow, is the tissue demand. And so when that happens, all the blood will go to the arterial side, or try to at least, to deliver more nutrients and oxygen to the muscles and the tissues, so that we can do that task, or we can have that stress response or whatever. But if the heart wasn't there, all the blood would go over to the arterial side, and the venous side would collapse, and we die, because then blood couldn't flow through that anymore because it's collapsed. And so one reason that the heart is there, another reason the heart is there, is because it maintains pressure between the systems. If you look at like endurance athletes that are doing long-term, pretty vigorous exercise, there's plenty of evidence that shows that the heart is actually slowing the flow of blood when they're exercising. And the reason that hearts get bigger in endurance athletes like that is not because they're stronger at pumping blood, it's because they're stronger at stopping the flow of blood, because it's so intensely coming in. And so It just kind of throws things on the head there. But those are the two reasons that the heart is there. It's to energize the water in the blood and to maintain pressure in the system so that we don't, in times of need, we don't get a collapse and death. Yeah.
Okay, there's so many things in there that are probably going to be eye-opening to people, because I know it is for me. Like, again, for example, and I want to get to, and please don't let me forget to come back to the ultra endurance athletes, because that is something that I had to learn, I guess, earlier this year. I really backed off all the hardcore cardio I was doing. I was putting so much pressure on my body until I understood that you could actually cause scarring to the heart by overdoing it with too much cardiovascular work, and how that works, the stopping of the blood, and because I was that lay person that thought, well, Lance Armstrong probably has a heart the size of an elephant because it pumps so big, and that's just what he's conditioned it to do. That's not the case. So I definitely want to talk about that a little bit, just to give people an idea of how they need to balance their workouts. But also, let's talk about, like you talked about infrared. You talked about, you didn't say it, but basically grounding, getting these, this energy from the earth. These things that I guarantee you a lot of people that are listening to this podcast, they do just because they're told, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. Ben Greenfield and Dr. Stephen Hussey, they stand out and barefooted for 15 minutes every day because they say that it's good to go do some grounding, so I'm going to do that. But they don't understand the why behind it. And again, it goes back to, if you understand what you're doing and why you're doing things, you're much more likely, I believe, to continue on that path and forming the habit. So let's talk about some of those things that are happening. And then let's talk about, okay, because something that was new to me this year in my study was old blood versus young blood. When you hear that, you're like, blood? My blood is my blood. But based on what I'm hearing from you and what I've read in the book, it's very critical to understand what we put into our body and what we metabolize and what actually gets into our, to create the makeup of our blood. That's where I think a lot of people, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it was just me, but this is where I think a lot of people miss the point. They're so worried on just the heart as this muscular pump thing that as long as I pump it a lot, I'm okay. I can eat whatever the hell I want. I mean, as long as I just keep it exercised, instead of worrying about, no, it's the stuff that you're passing through the heart that's really the crux of the matter. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, one thing that we want to think about here is like a hydraulic ram, has to have enough fluid to work. It has to have enough fluid passing through it to actually work, to be functioning. So what if we're chronically dehydrated, and there's not enough water in the blood, or there's not enough water in our tissues that is stealing from the blood and going into the tissues, then that hydraulic ram system doesn't work as well, because there's not enough pressure, to maintain that flow, that sufficient flow to make sure that the hydraulic ram is working. Not only that, though, we need to make sure that, so like lots of times people, we talk about structured water, lots of times there's these devices now that people are like, oh, I want to structure the water that I drink. And yeah, you could do that, but you're not drinking structured water. If you were drinking structured water, you'd be drinking like water that was like a gel, Mm-hmm. So we're not really drinking structured water. You're energizing water so that when you drink it and it gets into your body, it can form that the structured water in the lining of the artery. But in reality, like, we don't really need to do that. I mean, there's all this water in your body. Why not work on exposing your body to the things that structure it? So energizing, so putting that into your blood, like that energy into your blood, that's really, really important. Because we worry about all these, like the biochemistry of the blood, and we take blood work and, the cholesterols and all the different metabolites that we can find in the blood. And that's fine. That's all useful stuff. But I'm more worried about, like, is there enough water? Is that water energized enough so that it can actually do what it's supposed to do in the body and help the heart function like it's supposed to function?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's kind of like just keeping an engine clean, right? I mean, if we think about that for our cars, it's like if you go my dad would never let me go to the cheap off-brand gas stations that were loaded up with a bunch of crap. He said there's too much alcohol or whatever, and it's going to dirty up your engine. We want cleaner fuels for our engine to keep it running clearly. It's kind of the same concept, right? We've got to keep good, clean fuel going through that heart. Now, talk to me a little bit about like what your current protocol is on the daily, making sure that you are structuring, or hopefully, structuring internally your blood to the energy that goes through you. What are some things that every day you're going to do to make sure that you maintain that practice?
Well, one thing dietarily is that I eat the freshest food possible.
Okay.
Because there's structured water in us, or there's energized water in us,
Mm-hmm.
and in plants and animals, it's energized as well. So the fresher the food, the better. So you can imagine, when we ship food from all over the world, by the time it gets to us, it's just not that fresh. So I eat as local as possible, and as fresh as possible, so that I get that. But that's not the main way that we would get the blood energized. But I use a sauna. I try 4 or 5 times a week. I use infrared sauna.
Mm-hmm.
Now that it's getting warmer, I'm trying to get out into the sun. That's the original source of infrared. And your body can absorb all kinds of wavelengths of radiant energy, but infrared is just the most highly absorbed by water. So infrared is really important, and 40% of the sun's rays are infrared. And also this time of year, I'm trying to get out and be barefoot on the earth as often as I can. Because that's really, really important for not only detoxing yourself from like bad electromagnetic fields, but also energizing, getting electrons into the system so that it energizes the water in the blood, and also calming your stress response. So lots of different things there. So those are my 2 main things that I do. But I'm also, I'm a chiropractor. My practice is very neuromusculoskeletal, so I have my hands on people, adjusting people all the time. And the electromagnetic field that we get from other people is also, something that helps energize water and energize the body. So I have that advantage there. But and then the other thing,
that's the toughest part for me, because I try to stay away from people as much as I possibly can. Dr. Hussey, I'll just be honest with you.
Yeah.
That's going to be the hardest part of the protocol for me.
Sometimes that's a good strategy, depending on the situation.
Right.
But I mean, the other thing is we don't want to expose our body to things that's gonna break down the structured water. Okay, so that could be, really, that's just oxidative stress and inflammation.
Yeah,
those types of things. They can, like this, the way the structured water forms is a very electronegative space. Okay. So it has a lot of electrons to donate, and these free radicals, or things that can act like free radicals, like to steal electrons. Mm-hmm. So that's a perfect place for them to steal it and break down the integrity of the structured water. And so, everything from different toxin exposures, everything from plastic to phthalates to heavy metals to artificial fragrances, all these different things that we're exposed to every day. We want to reduce our exposure to those. Chronic stress can lead to high levels of oxidative stress. Burning the wrong fuel source, being too reliant on glucose for a fuel source. I mean, it's okay to burn some glucose in certain times, and really the body's burning it all the time. But being too reliant on glucose can become problematic and create more oxidative stress than we want to. So those types of things are important too.
All right, and jumping around a little bit, because I know I marked it in your book, because I thought you did a great job of essentially what you're talking about, some research. Let me see if I can't find it. I know I can at least get to it. There was a certain form of research that you did not really like to go by, and basically, let me just kind of simplify it. It's because it essentially cherry picks data. It excludes a lot of things. It finds these correlations, like, okay, if you eat a lot of cholesterol, or a lot of people that have heart attacks or heart disease, you can look that they also eat a lot of cholesterol. So just that one correlation kind of becomes the founding basis for the whole hypothesis that cholesterol bad causes heart disease, without looking at all the other parameters and other inputs that are going on around that. So since we're talking about things we put in our body, let's talk about this thing that, as you say in your book, you can't talk about heart disease and the heart and heart health without mentioning cholesterol. And there's so much, in my opinion, maybe not just misinformation, but just confusing information about cholesterol. Is it good? Is it bad? What's good? What's bad? So kind of get this audience up to speed on just how they should view cholesterol and its function in the heart.
Yeah. So like you were kind of mentioning there, like this idea that cholesterol and saturated fat are the drivers of heart disease was born in the 50s and 60s, based on some bad and very low tier research.
Right.
So we're talking about epidemiology, and these are studies that basically can only show correlation, but not show causation. It can only show an association between two things. So the example that I give is like if you're standing on the side of the road and you see a traffic jam in front of you and it's also cloudy. Those things are happening at the same time. They're associated with each other in that way. But you cannot say that the clouds caused the traffic jam or the traffic jam caused the clouds. There's just no way you can prove causation. And that's how these studies are. That's like they're designed to show these associations so that you can say, okay, well, this is associated with each other. Now let's test it clinically, or let's test it with a randomized controlled trial and see if one is actually causing the other. However, those RCTs, those randomized clinical trials, are hard to do, especially in nutrition. They're very expensive to do. So lots of times they're not done. Most of the time they're not done. And so we go based off these associational studies that cannot prove anything. And so there's lots of associational studies that show that red meat is more associated with heart disease or with cancer or whatever. But there's also associational studies that show the opposite, because you can't rely on these studies, right? There's lots of studies that say that show that higher cholesterol is associated with better outcomes of health, but there's some that say that it's associated with poorer outcomes with health. And so it's like, which ones do we trust? And the point is, we can't trust them. But unfortunately, most of the nutritional recommendations that we get from academic institutions or government agencies are based almost entirely on these studies. And the idea that cholesterol and saturated fat is bad for us was based on these studies to begin with. And by the time they tested them out with clinical trials, which they did early on in like the 60s, by the time they tested them out and showed that they were wrong, the theory had already taken off.
Yep.
And so everybody kind of stuck to it for whatever reason. And now we're kind of stuck with these rising rates of disease in general, but especially heart disease. But yeah, so there's a lot of different issues with these studies. One of them is that you're relying on people to, like, basically you're just asking people what they ate. You're doing surveys, right? So like lots of people aren't going to remember what they ate, or they're not even going to know, like, oh, how much was that saturated fat? I don't even know if that's saturated versus unsaturated, so we're relying on those food surveys, which is really not a good way to do research. But then also there's this thing called healthy user bias. Like if someone's trying to be healthy and they're listening to these recommendations we're getting from these institutions and things, and the institution's saying, don't eat red meat, then the person's going to say, okay, I'm not going to eat red meat. But that person who's trying to be healthy is probably also likely to be managing their stress and not drinking, not smoking, eating a whole food diet, that kind of stuff. They're more likely to be doing healthy behaviors. So not only are they eating less meat, they're doing other healthy behaviors. So was it the eating less meat, or was it the other healthy behaviors that created health and better outcomes in these people? And we can't, like, these types of studies cannot account for that. They can't show that kind of thing. And then vice versa, if it shows that people who ate more red meat had poorer health outcomes, it can't account for the fact that this person who's eating more red meat may not care as much about their health because they're not listening to those recommendations to eat less red meat. And so they're also eating red meat, and that is, comes with fast food, or they're not, or they're smoking and drinking, and they're not managing the stress. They're not exercising because they're not into your health. They're not listening to this. They don't care.
Right.
And so like, you can't flesh that out. You can't figure out if it was actually the red meat that they're eating, or was it the other unhealthy behaviors they were doing that caused poor health in these people. And so this is just some of the major shortcomings of these types of studies, and they were never intended to base our recommendations off of. And like I said, unfortunately, that's what not just dietary advice is based on, but a lot of different health advice is based on.
I think most all federal guidelines, this is the type of research that they do, because it's usually, and I hate to be that cynical, but you look at so much of the studies that get highlighted, that we listen to, that literally become gospel to here in the States. It usually is some crappy research. It was not a controlled study. There's all sorts of parameters and inputs that were not accounted for. It's just they take one correlation that essentially supports a hypothesis that, some politicians can go, oh, here you go, boss, take it and run with it. We've done a study, and there you go. And, one of my friends, Dr. Michael Leeds, he talks about how this happened with all the industrial seed oils that we now see in all our food, because that's kind of where the rise of that came, right? Is like, well, all of a sudden the federal government started saying all these whole fats, these animal fats, are bad, and vegetable oils are good. And and if you look, I mean, you look at the obesity rates and just the heart disease from the time the federal government started hammering into our heads that fat is bad, that meat is bad, but this vegetable oil garbage, which is poison, is good. I mean, there's a correlation for you, but we're that's so far down the road that, like, when someone like you, or I for that matter, come along and say, hey, you need some animal protein, go ahead. You need that good grass-fed butter. Stay away from the margarine, for God's sake. They go, it takes them a while to adjust because that's just been preached to us for so long, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of like that's what everybody hears everywhere, and it's all, unfortunately, all sponsored heavily by food industry.
Absolutely.
There's and it's just, it's the state of a capitalist society. People want to protect their bottom line, they want to protect their product, and so there's a lot of marketing and a lot of influence a lot of money pumped into the idea that saturated fat and meat is bad, because it makes a lot of money for the companies that make these processed grains and sugars and vegetable oils, and so they keep that money flowing through there. And it's the same with, unfortunately, medical research these days. There's a lot of money going into these studies that are trying to promote or give a favorable, conclusion or result in these studies to promote, so that the pharmaceutical companies can promote their product. And so if you look at a lot of the studies where it says that cholesterol and saturated fat are causing disease, they're funded by companies that make statin drugs and want to sell a lot of statin drugs, because the more the idea is out there that cholesterol, and the more doctors are preached to that cholesterol is a cause of heart disease, the more statin drugs can be prescribed, which is the more money the pharmaceutical companies will make. And people may see that as negative thinking, but like, that's the reality. That's how it works. There's plenty of evidence and documentation that this is what actually happens, and I cite a lot of it in my book. And so we have to be wary of that, and we have to know our sources and kind of learn what to trust and what not to trust, because that is going on within the industry.
So that's a perfect segue. And by the way, so I just had on my show Dr. Gus Vickery. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. Gus or know him or not, but he's actually in Asheville. And so I was like, because you went to North Carolina State. And I was like, I didn't know there was a correlation there. And he made a quote during our interview that has and will forever stick with me. And he said that if something has been designed, basically to operate a certain way, you must honor that design. That's the way it is. And it's kind of like our ancestral bodies, which is something that I have become much more keen to understanding why our neurochemicals, why they release at the times they do, what our hormones function is, and relating it back to our ancestral body. And one of the things that I tell anyone that'll listen, I'm like, you got to understand something. Your brain does not understand it's 2022 and not 2022 BC. It has no clue. It was designed to survive. And all of these things function for a reason. And if you can better understand why, then at a minimum, and this, again, you lay it out very well in your book, that you're not trying to come up with some conspiratorial theory about, why you should never take medicine and big pharma's against us and they're all about the greed. No, you don't do that at all. But what you do is you lay out the case, in particular with statins, as to what are they blocking? I mean, there's a natural function there that's supposed to happen, and they're causing a yield to what our ancestral body was designed. So it's not honoring that design by stopping something. So talk to the listeners a little bit about what these statin drugs do, so that at a minimum they hear it and they go, well, I've had high blood pressure. I just saw my physician, and I'm not on it yet, but I'm thinking about getting on statins. That's what my physician said might be an option. Give that listener at least an understanding of, hey, and no diagnosis is happening on this podcast. That's not what Dr. Hussey's doing. We're not making any medical recommendations. We're just saying, here's an understanding for you to just think a little bit more about what you're doing from the way your body was designed, what it naturally does, and here's what you're about to do. Can you kind of describe that? And I hope I set that up the right way. I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll start with saying that, we're obsessed with these biomarkers and these ranges of these biomarkers, when in reality, we're taking, the normal ranges have been established based on a population that is not living in a way that it did for millions and millions of years, before modern society came about. So because we've only been taking these blood markers since like maybe the 60s, maybe the 50s, something like that. And so our normal ranges are not based on what a normal lifestyle would look like for humans. So we have to take that into context first.
Excellent.
And so then, we're looking at these biomarkers like cholesterol, and we see that it's not in the normal range, whatever that is, actually. And then we aggressively try and change that. Instead of looking at the person as a whole and thinking maybe the body's doing this for a reason. Maybe this is exactly what it's supposed to do. Maybe the definition of health is the ability of the body to adapt to certain situations, and maybe it's trying to adapt to a situation right now. Mm-hmm. Maybe it needs this cholesterol, or maybe there's something else going wrong that's causing this high cholesterol. Like, instead of thinking that, we say, okay, how can we forcefully change the biochemistry to lower that cholesterol? Because that's what we've been told is best for us. That's what, the research that's being funded to tell us that, so that we'll do that. But if you look at, so when we talk about biochemistry, and like, especially the biochemistry of cholesterol, like, there's like this 20 to 30 step process of what your body does to take a fatty acid and make cholesterol from it. And this happens in the liver. And in the second step of that, a statin comes in and it blocks that second step, so that cholesterol is never made. Okay. And that lowers cholesterol in the blood because it's never made and put into the blood. However, the big issue with that is, we don't get cholesterol at the end of that, which cholesterol is essential for life. And there's plenty of evidence that statins and people with lower cholesterol, like 80 or lower LDL cholesterol, have all kinds of issues, cognitive issues. They're more prone to diabetes. They have sexual dysfunction. They have muscle pain, all kinds of stuff, because cholesterol is an essential molecule for these things. And so the thing is that in that 20-step process, there's lots of different metabolites that are made in that process of making cholesterol. And so lots of those different metabolites are used for different things. They're not just these steps that happen. Like, the body takes some of those things and uses them for different stuff. One of those things is to make antioxidants, like selenoproteins that are eventually made into antioxidants. And that's really, really important for maintaining low oxidative stress and inflammation and things like that. Another one is there's a molecule called dolicol that is made from one of these metabolites that is incredibly important for their insulin receptors, so maintaining insulin sensitivity. And that's really, really important for warding off heart disease, because insulin resistance is one of the underlying causes of pretty much all disease, but especially heart disease. And so all these metabolites, like, when you block the second step, none of those things are made. Not only do you not get cholesterol at the end of that, but none of those things are made. So the body doesn't have those things as well, which explains why we get all these side effects from statin drugs. And the most frustrating part is that, there's really no sound evidence, and people may argue with me about this, but there's really no sound evidence that cholesterol is the driving force in heart disease. There's a lot of associational evidence that maybe smaller dense LDL particles, or Lp(a) or ApoB particles are more associated with higher rates of heart disease, but those things are not driving heart disease. The things that create those things are what's driving heart disease, which is damage to those molecules. Those molecules become higher when we get damage to tissues in the body, damage to cholesterol. So it's not just the cholesterol that's getting damaged, there's other things too. And so, not only are we causing more issues with statins are one of the, it's like pain medications and statins are always like 1 and 2 as far as the most prescribed drugs out there. There's even talk of like people wanting to put statins in the drinking water, and it's just insane to me, because the whole idea that high cholesterol is driving heart disease is not well founded, and then the approach is just is based on that false idea, and it's creating a lot of issues. So not only not fixing the problem, not helping people not have heart disease, but we're also creating a lot of other issues for these people. And I don't think we really need any more evidence besides the fact that statin drugs are some of the most prescribed drugs in the world, but especially in the United States, and heart disease is continuing to rise. So if they were working, if they were helpful, you'd think that we'd see some kind of dip in the numbers at least, but yep. We don't. So we need a different approach. We need a new way of thinking. We need to reassess.
I agree wholeheartedly with all that. And I think one of the things that is, I've said it on this podcast so many times now since I've kind of got my brain around it, that our habitat, so I like to use this analogy. The way we were designed, we used to have to go out, and the big concern was we were hunting for food, right? And the big concern was the saber-toothed tiger behind the bush attacking us. Now it's flipped. There are no saber-toothed tigers, and there is so much food and so little effort put forth to go get it. And then there's so much bad food. And there's all of this stuff that has the high fructose corn syrup and has all these things that will just shoot your glucose through the roof. Now, talk a little bit about, because I don't hear enough, and I would imagine, again, I don't think I'm that unique. I bet there's a lot of people listening to this that probably do not associate sugar and high fructose or glucose with heart disease. Yet there is a strong case to be made, especially now if you do combine the bad crappy fats and then you put the sugar in it. That's where the heart can really have a problem. Talk a little bit about the way glucose can scar the heart, because that was a complete eye opener for me whenever I was reading the book.
Yeah, so the heart it seems like it has this unique metabolism where it prefers fatty acids and ketones for fuel, even in the presence of glucose, which in lots of other tissues in the body, that's not the case. Like if glucose is present, it'll burn that first. Mm-hmm. Like there's this oxidative priority, like what it burns. And, but it doesn't seem to be the case for the heart. Like it'll choose fatty acids and ketones. And I think, in my opinion, is that the reason is that when the heart burns more glucose than it wants to, it leads to issues. So just like if you go for a run and you start to feel that muscle burn in your leg, that's because your body is burning a lot of the glycogen stored in the muscle. It's burning a lot of glucose when you do that, because it needs to. It needs fast energy. It has to go through it. But that creates a buildup of lactic acid and hydrogen ions that creates this muscle burn, right? And so the heart doesn't want that to happen at all. And it's a muscle too. And so that's why it prefers to burn these fatty acids and ketones, so it can maintain that steady contraction constantly and not get this buildup of lactic acid and hydrogen ions. However, there are situations that I describe in the book where the heart can be forced to burn more glucose than it wants to. And it's always burning some glucose. Like all tissues in the body are always burning all three fuel sources, but some more than others, depending on the tissue. And so when the heart's forced to burn more glucose than it wants to, it can create this lactic acid buildup and hydrogen ions. And so sometimes, what we call angina or chest pain can be caused by, lack of blood flow to an area. But I also describe in the book I think that's kind of a rare thing too, based on how blood flow gets around the heart, even in the presence of a narrowing of an artery. And I think it's more related to metabolic shifts, or the heart getting signals to burn more glucose than it needs to. And it has to do with oxidative stress, has to do with being metabolically inflexible, and it has to do with an imbalance in our stress response. And when those three things happen, the heart can get signals to burn more glucose than it wants to. And that, to me, is the cause of this chest pain, this angina. Especially when we exert ourselves and the heart has to contract a little faster to keep up with the demand of blood flow to the tissues, then more glucose is burned. And that's why people with chest pain or angina are just intolerant to exercise. They just can't make it to the mailbox or whatever, because it hurts. And so to me, it's more of a metabolic shift due to this unique metabolism of the heart. And so there are times when if we're getting that signal, if we're giving the heart that signal to burn more glucose than it wants to, and that lactic acid builds up, it can actually damage the heart tissue, the muscle. It can actually lead to scarring of the heart, which is what I think happens when I talk about studies in my book where we have these people who have been endurance athletes their whole life, and they're giving the body that stress signal, and it starts burning. The heart starts burning more glucose than it wants to. And there's some studies that show that people who have spent their life doing endurance athletes have more intense scarring of the heart tissue, which can predispose us to things like heart failure and things, because the heart's just not functioning like it's supposed to, even though we've misunderstood how the heart's supposed to function in the first place. But yeah, it all has to come down to this metabolism, this unique metabolism of the heart. It's just fascinating when I dove into all this. Like, to figure out that there are these things, and it's just, why is it not talked about, in medical circles? Or maybe it is, but it wasn't told to me, and it's definitely not told to patients and things like that. So yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that, and that's one of the things that's really eye-opening to me, was this whole idea, and I'm glad you brought that back up, because I want to make sure that the listener understands this, is that, you don't hear of a lot of, and this was, I don't know, I never paid attention to it until either Peter Attia or Ben Greenfield. It's one of those guys made the point that you don't hear of a lot of ultra endurance marathoners or even marathon runners living to be centenarians. You just don't really hear that much. You're like, well, if anyone should be in a category where that's the case, it should be those folks, and it's just not the case. And so then when you start to realize that emergency burn almost, and that's kind of what it is. Like, I mean, you will actually start a fire to control a fire, right? When it's out in the redwood forest of California. Yeah, that's kind of what our body's trying to do. It's trying to fight fire with fire, but it was not meant to do it chronically and on an ongoing basis. Eventually, it's going to get bewildered, and that was so eye-opening to me. And not that, like, I did a Zone 2 training this morning, which is just kind of, I think for me, is somewhere around a 263 watt output for, an hour. And that's, whereas I used to always hit it hard, 45 minutes to an hour every day of cardio, even on days that I was doing resistance training, and my body fat percentage was higher. My cardio was, I guess, good, but I looked weathered and old. My body was just telling me, I wouldn't listen, and that, hey, this is not good. And then I finally started listening to some of this advice and better understanding how the heart works, and realizing, there is such thing as too much cardio. And it was a game changer for me. Now, one of the things I want to ask you about, I just scheduled an appointment to have my blood panels done. And as much as you can tell the listener, I actually took Mike Mutzel's class where he talks about high intensity health. Highly recommend it. Anyone follow Mike? He's a great guy. And he talks about, there's things that are going to be just kind of standard boilerplate on every single blood panel. But there's also some things that may not be, that you just want to make sure, say, hey, doc, I want to see these. Can you give the listeners what they should be looking for? And as well as, we get, again, you mentioned it earlier, we get so obsessed with these biomarkers and these ranges that have kind of been set, again, for a population that's in a habitat it was really not designed for. Whenever someone goes to get first of all, how important is it to get your blood work done? And then two, how do we get the most benefit from that information?
Yeah. I mean, I can make an argument that blood work is not as important as we think it is. It just because it's the one thing that we can easily, most commonly test, doesn't mean that it's the best one.
Yep.
And we have to take it into context. Like, blood work is looking at one tissue in the body, which is the blood, at one snapshot in time. Yep. How do we really know how much information that really gives us?
Kind of like you tried to figure out your glucose levels in real time. It's like, yeah, well,
oh yeah,
that's what it was a while back. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, you think about that. Like the CGMs have totally transformed my ability to regulate diabetes, because I'm looking at things in real time. I'm seeing exactly what it was all the time.
Got it.
Right. And whereas before I'm having to take a snapshot in time, I take my blood sugar and it's like, that's what it is right now. I don't know if it's going up or down. I don't know anything like that.
Yep.
So it's the same with blood work. We're taking this one snapshot in time. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. But it can be useful. Like, there are things that, I mean, I definitely look at people's blood work. I think that it is a useful biomarker or different biomarkers that we could look at. And so some of the ones that I think are really important that are not commonly taken. Well, first of all, it's like a cholesterol panel is commonly taken. But the way we look at it should be different. We should be looking at the trig to HDL ratio, and not just total cholesterol or total LDL cholesterol. We should be looking at that kind of stuff. The trig to HDL ratio is an indicator of whether or not we're metabolically healthy and insulin resistance and things like that, which is way more important, in my opinion, as far as predicting risk for heart disease. But also a fasting insulin level is really important, which is not commonly taken at all. Most of the time you ask your doctor for that and they look at you like you have three heads or something like that. Because they don't necessarily understand why it's so important to take. And it's important because you can pick up on insulin resistance well before it becomes changes in blood sugar. And you can intervene then rather than waiting for it to become a pathologic state of altering blood sugars, what we know as prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. So really important to take that. Then those are the two best, I think, for like metabolic health. And then the other things you want to look at is your levels of inflammation and oxidative stress. And you can really get into the weeds about testing for inflammation and oxidative stress. There's lots of different biomarkers you can take, but I think that one of the most basic ones that you can get a general marker of inflammation is the high sensitivity C-reactive protein. That one's fairly commonly taken. It's on lots of cardiac panels because it is recognized within Western medicine that inflammation is a cause of heart disease. So they look at that kind of stuff. But I also like to take GGT, which is a liver enzyme that tells me about, is oxidative stress happening in the liver?
Yep.
Which if it's happening in the liver, that's a big deal because that's the thing that it makes lots of antioxidants. So if it's not able to keep up, that's a big deal.
Right.
So there's those, but you could look at all kinds of stuff. You could look at damage to fatty acids in the blood. You could look at damage to DNA in the blood to look at inflammation and oxidative stress. But lots of those things get like kind of obscure and expensive. So yeah, I like to take those things, the C-reactive protein and the GGT. But yeah, like those are, when it comes to like purely cardiovascular stuff, like those are useful there. You could look at hormones, but I think that hormone imbalance is more an issue with the liver not able to process hormones, which could be endotoxemia and things like that. And so that's like another issue altogether. But if people are looking for just like general stuff, look at the metabolic health and look at the inflammation, oxidative stress, and go from there.
Perfect. Now, to kind of wrap things up, I know for me, and not that my opinion really matters, to me, this book is for anyone who wants to just have it says understanding the heart, a better understanding of the why these things that we're talking about, why you would do that. And again, my biggest takeaway is this idea that you can't just focus on the heart in isolation. You need to focus on all of the other things like the structuring your blood and making sure that the intakes are good. And again, so many people, they hear heart health and eating a healthy diet and exercising, that's good for my heart. But I think that's where it stops. I think the book does a great job of going, well, here's what makes your heart function well whenever you pay attention to how healthy your blood is. It's going to pass through and charge the heart and everything. Tell me, what was your hope? Who was the audience? Because I know whenever I've written a book, my editor always says, why are you writing it? Why you? And who's your audience? So I want to make sure that everybody knows that, hey, from the author, this is who the book is for and why you wrote it.
Yeah, well, I mean, heart disease is the number one killer in the world. So there's a lot of people who are directly affected by it because they have it. And there's even more people with loved ones who have it because all those the people who have it have loved ones, So it's for those people. It's for those people to try and understand what this is, why it's happening, and what we can do about it, because, like I said, in the hospital, I had these doubts and about, releasing the book, and I was filled with a lot of self-doubt. But when I experienced what I experienced, I realized that I thought about, those literally millions of people who are going to be in that same situation that I am. And I was just like, they don't have all the information, and what they're being told is wrong, or a lot of what they're being told is wrong, as far as what I was told in the hospital those 3 days. And so I was just like, I have to get this out there to those people, even if they decide to go a different route, that's fine. They need to know the whole story though. And so the audience is really everybody, because this is not just a book about heart health. Like, these are things that, Western medicine likes to categorize things. And you have a cardiologist, you have a urologist, you have a oncologist, they like to categorize things, but in reality, the things I talk about in this book don't just create heart health. They prevent all types, they create health in general, and they help you prevent all types of the disease. And so it's really important to make that distinction. So the book is really for everyone, but especially people with a vested interest in cardiovascular disease, whether it runs in their family, or they have someone, or they're struggling with it right now, or they have someone who's in their family who's struggling with it. We need to start understanding these things. We need to start sharing information and having open, honest discussion about it in order to find the root cause of why these things are happening and the best approach going forward.
Yeah, well said. And that's the thing I want people to understand. And it's why I harped a little bit early on about the whole ancestral design and how our bodies function. You do a great job of leading up to where we come from and why these struggles have taken place in this modern habitat. I mean, the 10-cent calorie, I've said before, the 10-cent calorie is a miracle. It's fed a lot of people at a very cheap price. But with all these marvels of modern medicine and industry, there are some unintended consequences. So I think the book spells out, here's how you navigate in what could be the greatest times that we've ever existed. I mean, we're more comfortable and our medicine is better, but you got to understand how your body actually works. And I think you do, I think that's kind of what we covered last time, which I love to talk about, just overall health and wellness. And it's cool because guys like you have come along and you've taken your gift as a medical professional. And this is exactly what I told Dr. Gus Vickery. I was like, he's a general practitioner, and yet he's doing now integrative medicine. So many guys like you that are medically trained are realizing exactly what you just said. It's like, well, I understand certainly more about medicine and the application to everyone in a whole array of areas than just this one area. Why wouldn't I take that and help people? And there is so much information out there if people are just willing to go and realize, just go get curious about, so why do I get in a bad mood? Why is it whenever I just crush a half a freaking pound cake that I tend to be kind of grumpy afterwards? Why do these things happen? Why is it that every time I eat lunch and then take a long trip that I'm wanting to fall asleep at the wheel, whereas if I'm hungry, I seem to be alert and have all these things, and so I'm grateful that you're using your knowledge and your research and your curiosity to benefit those of us out here that are willing to open our minds and listen to anyone that's willing to put forth the good information and back it up. And that's one of the things that I think you do so well too, Doc, is that you document and you're very respectful of, other lanes, if you will, of medicine, to say, hey, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying, I've researched it and here's what I found. And there's not one thing that I found that I disagree with.
Yeah, it's really just about laying the information out there. I want people to think whatever they want to think, but I want them to have all the information before they make up their opinion,
So where can people find you? Where can they find the book? I got mine off Amazon. How can people get to you?
Yeah, so the book is on Amazon, and if people want to use a different source, it's on the publisher's website, which is Chelsea Green. It's on Books A Million and Barnes & Noble, things like that. So people can go there. It's an audiobook and ebook as well. My website is resourceyourhealth.com, which is where I have my blog and my health coaching, and the books are on there, things like that. And then I'm on social media as well, on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, as Dr. Stephen Hussey. So people can find me there, message me there if they'd like. And that's where people can figure it out.
Awesome, man. Well, sit tight. I'm going to show the book one more time here. There it is, Understanding the Heart by Dr. Stephen Hussey. It's a phenomenal read. This should be in your library. I say this all the time. A good book for me has to have good utility value. This is not one that you just read for entertainment. This should be a reference guide for anyone who's truly interested in maintaining good, not just good heart health, but just understanding how the body functions properly. And so if you are watching this on the YouTube channel, please subscribe. Please leave some comments, get those algorithms going. And Dr. Hussey, if you ask a question that I don't have the answer, then I will definitely get it to him, or he can answer directly. Also, if you're listening to this on iTunes, please consider leaving a 5-star rating. And then the last thing, don't forget to go to jasonrightnow.com and subscribe to the Vitruvian Letter. This is my newsletter where I geek out on stuff just like this, compile all the information that I've gathered throughout the course of the week and all the things that I'm doing to try to improve always and live up to this show's motto. And until we see you again, thank you, Dr. Hussey, for coming on. Thank you guys for listening. I'm Jason, and I'm out.